All indications point to the fact that we may have a federal election this year, with Scott Morrison looking to capitalise on his pandemic popularity. This leaves Labor leader Anthony Albanese with an uphill climb. There has been much criticism of Albanese's leadership suitability of late, which I think is unfair. Albanese got really unlucky with this pandemic. It enabled Scott Morrison to play the hero and have his face at the forefront of mostly positive media coverage for months. His popularity has soared in the polls, while Albanese flounders about 30 points behind. So what's Albanese to do? It's difficult to attack the government on anything COVID-related, as their response has been mostly popular. Then there's the barrage of unsolicited advice thrown around about how Labor needs to abandon the anti-coal rhetoric and identity politics to recapture formerly Labor working-class seats, which ignores the risk that, in doing so, Labor could potentially lose leftwards-leaning inner-city seats to the Greens. Fortunately, Albanese's recent policy revelations might marry the two, with the focus on shoring up secure work for casuals, thus appealing to younger voters who may lean Green, plus a more moderate emissions reduction plan. These are the kinds of policies Labor should campaign on. But nobody will hear about them while the pandemic is front and centre. Scott Morrison will have his face all over the looming vaccine rollout, and thus get another bump in the polls. As such, Albanese must shift the narrative away from COVID and onto the future. But this is difficult when Labor premiers in Queensland, Western Australia and Victoria keep shoving COVID into the spotlight by instigating snap lockdowns and border closures, particularly when New South Wales has proved competent contact tracing and a cool head are key to managing COVID. Albanese should have a stern word to these premiers about their pandemic hysterics. He should tout COVID recovery statistics and steer media coverage away from its current catastrophising. He should emphasise how much we stand to gain, rather than what we have sacrificed, as other politicians do. In short, he should sell hope, not fear. And he should have done it yesterday, because Scott Morrison is getting a free pass. Tanvir, upwards, downwards, leftwards, rightwards, forwards. Which way do you think Anthony Albanese should go from here?
Thanks, Daisy. Look, I think it's a great topic, and it really raises the questions, what should an opposition do in the midst of a pandemic? Because it's often built a bit of a wartime footing, and often in those wartime footings, there's almost a pressure on the opposition to keep quiet and keep a united front. But that's not what we need. We need strong oppositions. And then Albanese's also come under pressure, as you've alluded to come up with some messaging, form his own story, if you like. He sort of rose with this whole authentic working class story. He's a Housing Commission boy. He's got a beer named after him in Sydney. So he's got that authenticity thing down packed in a way. But then he needs some policies to differentiate. But then he's fighting what's called the pandemic fog by some commentators, where any messaging not about, say, the vaccine or case numbers, etc., just struggles to get through. He's come up with his big policy with childcare, now industrial relations, which, they think they have, firmer footing. I mean, it's hard to... I think either way he's in trouble. I mean, when we look around the world, arguably the most successful opposition candidate, I mean, Trump is fairly unique. Most incumbents have become more popular or increased their powers. Places like Israel, Hungary became a bit more authoritarian. But Keir Starmer, the British opposition leader, Keir Starmer, he's actually done reasonably well. He's been able to attack, and realistically, there have been lots of mistakes by the Tories. So, look, I think he's a good model where Albanese needs to still look, he's part of the united front, we're after this vaccine, but pick and choose some messages and, go for federally. Because you're right, I think Scott Morrison's had a bit of an easy run, and the premiers have taken centre stage.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, great points, Tanvir. Now, Justin, on the subject of Albanese, I know people who live in his electorate and they adore him. They think he's the most wonderfully community-minded person. He knows everyone's name, what streets they live on. But Wonderful. They reckon that maybe that means he sort of, it's lovely, but they think maybe that means he might lack sort of the killer instinct that's needed to be opposition leader. But I don't know. What do you reckon?
Look, I really don't know who he is, to be honest. I don't have any connection to Anthony Albanese at all. He hasn't managed to get into my heart, and he hasn't managed to get into my mind. I just really don't know what he stands for. Now, I'm sure he's had a go. I'm sure he's been trying to sell it, and he's not the worst guy in the world. He's certainly not the worst opposition leader or Labor leader that there has ever been, even if we just go back in recent times. But he's been selling next to nothing. And yes, he's up against it with COVID. I mean, this is just a political nightmare for him, to be honest. It's a crisis that he could well and truly do without. But what's he going to do about it? Do something about it. Get out there and be a strong opposition leader. There are many ways that he could be doing it. I think the thing is that people have got to try and warm to the idea of Anthony Albanese being a Prime Minister. Forget opposition leader. They've got to look at him. If he's got any chance at an election, they've got to look at him and say, this guy could be the Prime Minister. And I am yet to find a person, left, right, up, down, black, white, anywhere. I'm yet to find a person who has said anything like, geez, Albo's going to be a really good Prime Minister when the time comes. He just doesn't have them there, and he's got to find a way to get them there, I think.
Yes, it is very difficult for him, and I think he needs to kind of find a point of difference, as I was saying, in this pandemic saga. But Caleb, I mentioned in my editorial that perhaps if Albanese started, selling hope, stopping so many politicians of fear-mongering, maybe if he started touting the fact that lots of people have recovered, that working from home might help families in the future, if that whole trend keeps up, do you think maybe selling hope rather than fear could be the right point of difference for it?
Well, I think really he has to sell hope that he's not going to be a repeat of Bill Shorten. That's why Labor lost. That's why Labor lost the last election. They took a suite of policies to an election that simply were not in sync with traditional Labor voters, and traditionally that is people of a working class background. The problem for Albanese is that he, of course, hails from the left of the Labor Party, and it's not all that often that you have a leader of the Labor Party from the left, both on state and federal levels. Generally, the done thing is you have the leader from the right and you have a deputy leader from the left. Now, the problem with the left of the Labor Party, of course, is that they know many of their seats, including Mr Albanese's, are under threat from Greens. And so there is a desire to pull themselves further to the left in order to bring those Greens voters across to them. But it doesn't work in the rest of the country. The last federal election proved that. So the hope that Albanese needs to sell is that the Labor Party will come back to being a working class party, a party of the working people. And his biggest challenge is that the federal government has done an excellent job of handling the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, he can't stand up as an opposition leader normally would and rail against the federal government, because if he did that, he would look like a fool. I mean, what is there to criticise? The one thing they've got to criticise, perhaps, is the slow rollout of the vaccine. But there is not much else to criticise in the federal government's rollout of or handling of the coronavirus pandemic.